We're joined by Kagiso Pooe, a public policy specialist from the Northwest University. Thank you so much for your time on the program today. So let's just start off with this. I want to start off with a comment that we saw a protester make a few hours ago, speaking to Minister Mahikeng. He said, "We're not violent people. In fact, many of us are ANC supporters, but we've waited for so long for our lives to improve, and it's our frustration that's now driven us to this point."
I think that comment can be shared by most people in any province in South Africa, but when it comes to the Northwest particularly, you actually have to look at, if you've done a good historical look at the Northwest, it's actually a deja vu feeling, because during 1994, 1996, President Mandela was actually called in to actually officiate who should actually become the next premier of the province. Northwest Province has always been an embattled province. If you look at the early years when Northwest Province was created, there was actually 3 factions, and it's never been a stable place, and this stability has actually impacted on people's livelihoods. It needs to be remembered that Northwest Province actually houses most of South Africa's natural mineral resources, and the question needs to ask, why have people's lives not improved in that province in particular? And I'd like to put it down to the issue that there's always been poor leadership. Now, most people would like to associate the Northwest Province with Popo Molefe. Popo Molefe was actually President Mandela's solution. He was actually an outsider brought in to try actually mediate between the 3 different factions. So what's actually happening now is actually, we hate to say it, a normality within the Northwest Province, that there's always somebody who gets brought in, there's always a faction that gets angry, they wait and abide for their time, and I think the current premier is actually just experiencing what brought him to power. Basically, it's another faction that wants to get in. I think the most interesting thing is to say, why would a president cut his trip short to the UK and actually come and attend to this? And I think it maybe speaks to the fact that in December, he did not get an outright majority. He is the president of the ANC only by a slim margin. So how he handles Mr. Supra is very interesting, because whether people outside Northwest like it or not, he happens to have some pull in the province.
Let me just ask you, before we come to the relationship between the president and that province, how would you sum up Supra Mahimapelo's reign as Premier of the Northwest?
I think what I say, he's a slickster. Very charismatic, very modern. He appeals to a lot of young people. But the question needs to be, what has he done? And I think that's the key thing. With all his slicksters, by slickster, I don't mean it in a negative way. He's very charismatic, very good. But the question needs to be, have people's lives improve? And I'd say it's actually been poor leadership on his part. Because if you remember, I think it's only about 8 months back, there was actually the Botshabelo region within Northwest Province actually taking him to court, actually saying, why are you locking out from the December conference? So basically, it's just been what I term as another normal ANC. I don't like to call them leaders, because I think we throw that title away. He just happens to be another person who really did not have a vision for where this province was supposed to go. He found it that, listen, it's a good place to be at the time. How do I get around it for my people? And we've seen the result. There's not been a lot of progress. I don't want to say there's been no progress, but it's not the perfect progress where we can simply say, wow, Northwest has improved socioeconomically. Northwest has improved to the level of saying it's now no longer, I don't want to say it's a drag on the economy, but it's actually moving away from mining, and it's another one of those provinces where it's diversified its economy. It just happens to be in the same position where he basically found it.
You know, it's interesting watching the people out there who've actually had to live through the various ANC administrations and therefore trace their problems back to the very first ANC administration. Each time a new administration comes into power, new people come along, new people offer to listen to the problems on the ground, offer to try and solve them. But the reality is, although there may be a new sheriff in town, these problems are over 20 years old.
This goes back to my argument when it comes to the ANC has always been this. We're too quick to give people titles of leadership. When my understanding, especially when you look in the terms of policy, when you speak about a leader, we talk about how do you lead institutions? What is the vision of the institution? If we're to ask you, what is the vision for a leader in the ANC? If we're to say, this is a perfect cadre or comrade of the ANC, who are we speaking about? It surely cannot be that we're looking at somebody's experience, because it seems like, no, we look at your age, we look at your issues of struggles, credentials. Now, if we were to take that and put it into how the economy and how the wider world works, what do your credentials of the struggle, what does your experience have to do with how the economy is moving? If the Chinese Communist Party, which you can say many things about it, even has a standard of what it means to be a leader. What's wrong with the ANC? Why don't they give us a clear indication to say, if you're an ANC leader, these are the qualities you have. This is how we measure you. This is how we expect that you will behave when you're a premier, a councillor. And I'm sorry to say, this is just basically as a result, everything that's been happening is a result that there are no standards and norms within the ANC. It simply goes to, are you popular? Are you popular? Yeah, I'm popular. Shall we vote you in? Yes, we'll vote you in. But then the question needs to be, those people that vote you in do not vote you in on a mandate of you're a leader. It's a mandate of what are you going to give me once you're in there. So for me, if you study policy, this is really not a surprise. In fact, we're going to do this for the next 20 years until the ANC actually steps up and says, listen, this is the criteria of what it means to be a leader. Now, their retort will be, listen, what about through the eye of a needle? If we go to the December conference, was it through the eye of a needle? Was it mentioned in any of the deliberations? No. So basically, there is no standard to be a leader in the ANC. Hence, I don't call them leaders. I think we should really make a distinction. What do we mean by a leader? A leader is somebody who comes from the community or somebody who says, listen, I have got results behind me. Therefore, this is what I'm waging my reputation to be. And unfortunately, I don't hear that debate within the northwest of the ANC. And I also don't hear it within the ANC itself.
But interestingly, as you say, this is going to have to be a slightly politicized decision for President Cyril Ramaphosa, which is, if as you say, it has been reason enough for him to leave an international investor trip to come back home. What does it mean about how he's going to maneuver in terms of how he deals with Supra Mahumapelo?
It's almost going to be like a domino. Once he deals with what's happening with Mr. Supra, the next question is going to be what's going to happen later in the month or later in the year with the KZN conference. If he does not show himself here to be quote-unquote the man, then people are going to start asking, especially people in KZN who are asking the question of, is this really the guy to represent us? It needs to be remembered that the Northwest opposition is not really, look, I'm never one for projections, but looking at the numbers, I'm not going to say, oh my word, there is a chance that the ANC will lose the Northwest province. But I would say there's a chance if the ANC doesn't get its act together, KZN could maybe it becomes something other than an ANC province. So the question is, if he does not handle this well, if he doesn't show himself to be decisive, firm as to how he handles this man, and more importantly, if he doesn't actually know which faction is actually creating this ruckus, and actually, I think they call it the balance of forces within the ANC, count the balance of forces properly, you'll find that he could find himself exposed going into 2019.
Thank you so much for your insight into that story. Lovely to have you with us today. Political analyst Kagiso Pooe.